Many people interested in foreign policy have told me when they come to the Indian Council of World Affairs in Sapru House, they feel a great sense of affinity with this institution because this was where the serious study of international relations in India all began.
The ICWA was set up by a small group of public intellectuals some years before our independence because they felt it important that India have an independent perspective on international affairs. Since then, the ICWA has gone from strength to strength, and it has been a long journey, almost 75 years. One particular milestone in that journey was in 2001, when the Indian Parliament passed an act declaring the ICWA to be an institution of national importance. We thus became a publicly funded independent think tank. Our governing council is headed by the Vice President of India, and the External Affairs Minister is its Vice President. We have 3 focus areas. The first is research, which is carried out by an in-house faculty. Very rigorous research on different parts of the world, encompassing the domain of area studies.
The Council has been very proactive in conducting dialogue and discussion on African affairs and India-Africa relations in order to promote an understanding on African affairs in India, an Indian perspective on Africa, given the priority that now Africa has in Indian foreign policy.
Within the Council, we have a renewed focus on Latin America and the Caribbean region. So we're looking through our studies to find new areas of cooperation such as renewable energy, climate change and the space technology.
Interacting with leading experts, diplomats, media persons and academicians has helped me nurture my research further.
We recently had the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook, which has a lot of convergence with the India's own Indo-Pacific construct.
The learning curve at the Council has been tremendous and it provides a strong foundation for my future research.
The second is policy. Because we are a think tank, and being close to policy, commenting on policy and helping formulate policy is an essential part of our functioning.
I think in the new age, what we're seeing much more of is that people want to be involved in foreign policy thinking. They want to have a voice. Now this is where ICWA comes in.
This is the platform where I for many years have come and interacted with the best in the world.
ICWA provides a valued platform for visiting foreign dignitaries to interact with informed Indian audiences. The third is outreach. This is most important because of our role as a public-funded independent think tank, and we carry this out by associating ourselves with as wide an audience in India as is possible. Colleges, universities, other think tanks, and of course with similar institutions elsewhere in the world.
What I would call the democratization of Indian foreign policy. It has moved to distant corners of the country. It is no longer a preserve of Delhi.
ICWA has a robust publications program which includes papers by the in-house faculty, invited papers and commentaries.
Good afternoon. On behalf of Indian Council of World Affairs, I welcome you this webinar on upcoming general elections in Myanmar, a test for the NLD-led democratic transitions in European regional integration.
Recording has started.
Before I request Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhay to conduct the proceedings, few housekeeping rules. Questions can be asked by typing in the chat box. Moderator will try and take all the questions, which our panelists will respond to you in Q&A session. Please keep your questions brief. I now request Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhay to conduct the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Samatha. Am I audible, visible? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you once again, Dr. Samatha. Welcome to the ICWA webinar on the 2020 upcoming general elections in Myanmar. Special welcome to my old friends, Dr. Khin Zaw Win, who is not yet with us, but I hope will join us very soon. Mr. Pradip Phanjoubam, as already introduced, founder of the Free Press Studies Journal Review of Arts and Politics, a very senior journalist and scholar. Dr. Prof.Nehginpao Kipgen, Executive Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies in the Jindal School of International Affairs, but also a very prolific writer on Southeast Asia and India-Myanmar relations, also someone who's from Myanmar, but with a tribal background, a Kuki, and therefore a foot on both sides of the border. And also Dr. Pradip Phanjoubam, I must say, in terms of our historical relations with Myanmar, Manipur has been one of the most important in that area, and there are historical memories of Myanmar rule in Manipur even now. So I think there's very few people that I can think of in the Northeast who can bring this kind of close perspective, historical perspective to our contemporary relations. And also finally, Dr. Rahul Mishra, once again a senior lecturer in the University of Malaya, KaulaLumpur, but someone with a background in the ICWA in the past, specialized in Southeast Asian studies. So all in all, an outstanding panel. And before we actually launch on the main subject, which is the upcoming general elections in Myanmar, the ICWA has requested me to speak a few words, which rather than devote on the elections per se, which I will leave our expert panelists to address, I'll make a few comments on the background to the elections, the historical background leading up to the elections, and linking it really with my time as ambassador in Myanmar. So I reached Myanmar in June or July 2013, when in fact Myanmar was already in the throes of its transition from military rule to initially a civilianized rule with ex-military reform-oriented personnel and generals, and then eventually, of course, leading to the November 2015 elections. It was a very exciting time because Myanmar, given its military past and its closed insular sort of stance to the world under the various military regimes after the military coup in 1962, was going through a phase of very intense and active diplomatic and economic opening. So, political reforms. Aung San Suu Kyi, who had been under house arrest, was released. There was a liberalization in the political atmosphere. Parties once again could be active. The NLD, which had been, operating behind the scenes, was able to come out. Other elections, other parties also came out. Media was opened up. A very robust, vibrant civil society started participating. Expatriates from abroad started returning. And side by side with this, the USDP government under President Thein Sein reinitiated, or we can say imparted a new kind of dynamism to the peace process, which had been languishing in individual ceasefires until then. On the economic side also, they introduced a unified exchange rate. There were special economic zones that were thrown open. FDI was warmly welcomed and invited, and in fact, during that period, very high levels of FDI were entering, or at least were being approved in Myanmar. The telecom sector was thrown in. The internet and social media, exploded virtually. In Telenor and Ooredoo won the first 2 licenses, and after that, others were opened up as well. The oil and gas sector was opened up, and in due course, by and by, international banking was also thrown open. On the diplomatic outreach, it was really a very dynamic period. The USDP government reached out to the world. President Obama took note. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, visited Myanmar, and that led to later on a visit by President Obama as well. And Myanmar started restoring diplomatic relations, which had been ruptured during the years of sanctions and isolation, with virtually all the West as well as East Asian countries opening up economies, relations with the United States, Europe. GSP preference was returned to Myanmar. Japan was very active. Other countries started taking part. ASEAN, of course, was very active. Singapore became a route for a lot of economic interest in Myanmar as well. On the peace process, the government made extraordinary strides. Until then, the Myanmar government, the previous government, had individual ceasefires with a lot of the ethnic armed organizations and insurgencies towards the west, north, and the east. But they took it upon themselves to then negotiate a nationwide ceasefire, which was expected to bring a peace and also a modicum of federalism into Myanmar. And this progressed extremely well under under U Aung Min, who was one of the two key ministers in President Thein Sein's office, who led this diplomatic opening as well as the economic reforms and the peace process. The other one was U So Thein. And they actually reached, by the time of the November 2015 elections in October 2005, a negotiated document, which was a ceasefire agreement. In the final steps, 7 of the 15 armed organizations that negotiated this were not able to join and actually sign the agreement, but 8 ethnic armed organizations did. India was one of the international observers invited for it, and Pradip was represented in that delegation that was actually led by our National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval. During this period of opening, of course, the United States made quite a lot of headway. Japan invested a lot in Myanmar. To some extent, China was put, perhaps for the first time after a long time in Myanmar, a little on the back foot. The Mitson Dam, which had been contracted a little earlier, was suspended soon after President Thein Sein won his election, citing popular opposition to that project. And in general, one could say that the Chinese were kept somewhat guessing by the USDP government. The November 2015 elections were a remarkable landmark. I was in the mission at that time, and with our other officers, we reached out. They invited international observers. We witnessed the elections in practically every state and region of Myanmar. Those were the days that WhatsApp and other social media had also opened, so we were able to keep track of the elections in real time. And I can honestly say that for elections that had taken place for the first time after the annulled elections in 1990 and perhaps going back into the 60s, the elections were remarkably orderly, reasonably free and fair, with the participation of political parties, and very peaceful. Not that there were not reports of some malpractice, but on the whole, the results were accepted by everyone, starting with the Election Commission, but also by the international observers, and in particular by the USDP and the military, even though they had a lot of reservations about what was happening. So Aung San Suu Kyi came in as obviously the leader of the NLD in this election, but under the Myanmar constitution, which was of course very heavily weighted towards the armed forces, she was not allowed to become the president by a clause in the constitution that denied anyone who was related to a foreigner to be the president. However, she was able to use other provisions of the constitution to declare herself state councillor and appoint a president, and also appoint herself foreign minister and effectively rule Myanmar. In the parliament, the military retained a 25% quota of, for the military, and any revision or amendment to the constitution required a 3/4 vote by the parliament, which was effectively vetoed by the 25% presence of the military. So, Aung San Suu Kyi started her term, which actually began in April 2016, shortly, just before I left, with a kind of a cohabitation where in Parliament, at least 25% plus the USDP elected members, who were roughly about 40 at that time, 40 plus, retained some control. But at the same time, they held the key ministries of Defense, Home, which also had the General Administration Department at that time, and of course, Defense, Home, and Border Affairs, which was a critical ministry. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi took over under tremendous international interest, and in fact, in many ways, Myanmar became the poster boy for democracy, just as in many other countries, actually democracy was turning more and more illiberal. Soon after, you had the US presidential elections and President Trump came into power, changing things on that side. But Myanmar was very much a poster boy, and it was expected that Aung San Suu Kyi would be able to take advantage of that international situation to lead Burma out of its isolation and into a new phase of reform and development and also openness. However, that was a bit short-lived. Firstly, in terms of her priorities, she put the topmost priority on what she called then the 21st century Panglong process, which was to pick up the peace process from where it was left off by the previous USDP government, and to try to clinch that as a precondition, in fact, for many of the other projects of nation building that she had in mind. But that peace process has been stuck on and not really progressed very much. In the meantime, I think the kind of goodwill that she had in terms of being able to use that goodwill for the economy was gradually ticking away. And starting in about 2017 and 18, or 2016 even, going back a little earlier, the Rohingya crisis suddenly broke up with a group that had until then not been known called the ARSA making an appearance in Rakhine State with an attack, an ambush on several border guard posts. And the crackdown that followed, first in 2017, then there was another set of attacks in 2018. And in the crackdown that followed, which was a very harsh crackdown, some 700,000 Rohingyas and others took refuge and took refuge in Bangladesh. And today, that position more or less remains like that. There has been very little movement on the return of the Rohingyas from Bangladesh, who are there in camps, with Bangladesh more or less single-handedly bearing the burden for the successive waves of Rohingya refugees. But on the other hand, a new element entered into the equation, which was the Arakan Army. The Arakan Army was one of four major insurgencies in the north at that time. In fact, it was very closely associated with the Kachin Independence Army that had not been part of the ethnic, the peace process with the ethnic armed groups. But it suddenly made an appearance, I think, initially in 2016 and gradually much stronger in 2018 and by 18, and now has a very strong presence along in northern Rakhine as well as in parts of Chin state, very much the areas that straddle the Kaladan project right now. As a result of these two crises, but particularly the Rohingya crisis, a lot of the diplomatic breakthroughs that were made by the USDP government were, I would not say aborted, but were checked. And in fact, relations with the West and with the Islamic world plummeted. Initially, there were several initiatives. Aung San Suu Kyi took an initiative vis-a-vis the Rohingya. The Chinese also took initiatives. Some of the Western countries tried to bring Myanmar to the United Security Council on this issue. Those were blocked by China. But overall, Aung San Suu Kyi suddenly lost her image as an icon of democracy and was seen as somehow shielding the Myanmar army in its crackdown and repression of the Rohingyas.
Okay.
In the midst of welcome, Dr. Khin Zaw Win.
Welcome. Sorry, you got mixed up.
No, but you're welcome in any case. Better late than never. Good to see you.
Okay. Nice to see you again.
Are you ready to be the first speaker? I'm just about to finish, and then would you be ready to speak first? Okay.
Yes, I can. I'm ready.
I think during this period, once again, Myanmar was back against the wall over its internal crises and problems, in particular the Rohingya crisis. China turned out to be its major protector and defender. And during this period, once again, Myanmar seemed to be thrown back into the pre-reform days when China was its major international ally. President Xi Jinping, in fact, made a visit to China in January 2020, just in fact, as COVID-19 was assuming a kind of international attention. Now, against this background, India's relations with Myanmar have remained unaffected. In fact, they have actually progressed. And we had a very interesting development, an unusual visit by the Foreign Secretary of India, Mr. Harsh Shringla, and the COAS, commander of the Chief of Army Staff of India, General M.M. Naravane, to Myanmar in October. Unusual visit in the sense that it was headed by both the Foreign Secretary in the Foreign Ministry and the Chief of Army Staff. Also in some ways signifying that to some extent, and this is a question that I hope we will discuss, whether this relationship, with civil-military relationship, between the armed forces and the civilian government of the NLD, or whichever civilian government returns after the election, is becoming something that is now more or less settled or established, a form of cohabitation between the armed forces and the civilians. So again, I just gave this as a kind of background particularly for those who may not be refreshed on recent Myanmar history. But this provides the background for today's talk, panelists, on the upcoming general elections in Myanmar, the first since November 2005. The fact that there is likely to be a civilian transition, even in times of COVID, as COVID has actually turned a little more serious, is an event in itself. And I think one of the questions is democracy being normalized? Is cohabitation being normalized? There are a number of questions that I'm sure our panelists will address too, but I'll just quickly rattle them down for you to note. I think civil-military relations we've already touched on. The center states, the relationship between the Burma heartland represented in regions and the ethnic states that surround the Irrawaddy Valley. A balance sheet of the NLD rule, both its successes and its failures. How is that likely to show up or result? How is it likely to be reflected in the upcoming elections? What about the progress in the economy? Has there been substantial progress in the economy since the USDP left? Of course, the Rohingya issues, and two questions particularly on the Rohingya issues. Whether the elections would make a difference to the Rohingya issues, and whether at the moment there are any diplomatic initiatives still going on that have any chance of success. My sense is that there were a few initiatives in the beginning, but those have mostly stalled by now. The whole issue of the Arakan army and the situation in Rakhine, where I believe most of northern Rakhine, the elections have been annulled, so there are going to be no elections. And an opposition party, an ethnic party led by the ANP, is by and large dominant. And in fact, maybe at the end of it, and I will touch on these in the question and answers, is how will the new government look at a post-COVID world with great geopolitical shifts and a reordering of relations between West and East? And once again, how will Myanmar position itself as it has done in the past, neutral or non-aligned or self-contained in its own way, and how will it manage the kind of tricky relations that are coming up as people talk about a kind of new Cold War, this time much closer to us in Asia. And of course, we will also touch upon India-Myanmar relations. So I will invite Khin Zaw Win, an old friend, someone who has been an activist, who has been in jail, and who has at the same time been a critic of NLD rule since it has come, someone who's been truly independent, as blue-blooded a liberal as one is likely to find in Myanmar. A pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Khin Zaw Win, and the floor is yours, after which we'll invite Mr. Pradip Phanjoubam.
Thank you, Pastor. I expect I have 12 minutes. Is it? 12?
Yes. Everyone has 12 minutes. At about 2 minutes before that, I will give a gentle reminder.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, sorry for the delay. There's been some mix-ups, my mistake. Well, to jump in straight away, first of all, I'd like to say that I will be presenting, as the ambassador said, my independent views. I'm neither pro-NLD nor pro-military. I was even thinking this panel might have included someone from the government of the NLD, and they can talk about the government's views. But I know it's very difficult to get people like that. No? And the title of the panel, I'd like to qualify it a little bit. It's a good title that ICWA has chosen. It's about the democratic transition that's led by the NLD. It's not led by the NLD. The NLD is the largest party, and Aung San Suu Kyi, everybody knows her. She's a globally recognized figure. But the democratic transition is a transition for the people of Burma. It's not like it's a large party, large movement that's led by one party or one person. Far from it. I suppose the ethnic nationalities would disagree with it even more. But that's And I mean, the ambassador has given a very good introduction. There is something that I'd like to first of all point out, that the old way of seeing the transition is not valid anymore. Yeah? It has really changed in the past 5 years. The ambassador mentions even cohabitation between the military and the NLD. Well, we are seeing something like that. It's not been made public, but let you know what the indications are. In the past, people talked about, well, Burma, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, is transiting to democracy, and the military is obstructing it. We are transiting to federalism, and the military is obstructing it. It's not that valid anymore. So there's even an indication that if landslide again, not just an ordinary majority, she wants to win by a landslide. Well, she still has support in the Burman heartlands, and if she wins by a majority, that's okay. If she doesn't win, she will have to enter into a coalition with someone. She has flatly dismissed coalitions with other parties, especially with ethnic parties. There's been a clean break between the NLD and the ethnic parties. So, as everybody thought, the coalition partner will be the military. Okay, the military retains up to now a 25% block in parliament. Well, in the two previous elections, the leading parties, the winning parties, won by a handsome majority, though they didn't need to enter into coalitions. But if a need arises, as well, the common term is that 25% military could become the kingmaker, and supposing party wins only 30%, but if they join with the military, it becomes 55%. And that is one fallback position. We don't see it in black and white, but it's a possibility for the NLD. Okay. And then we say that, well, this is a test for the NLD very much, and it's a test for all parties. Any election is a test for all parties, especially the incumbents. And the thing is, what does this 2020 election signify beyond just a change of parties? The NLD has not done well, on all fronts, except. But the thing is that Aung San Suu Kyi, well, we were just talking about dynastic politics in Asia. Well, the same thing in Burma too, in Myanmar too. She wants to win again, and also, as I've said, by a landslide, and she wants to lead the country again. I don't know what new programs or new platforms as the NLD, but it's all around it has been a huge disappointment, especially in peace, especially in federalism, especially in ethnic relations. So we'll see on Sunday. While campaigning is to go to the by the COVID second wave pandemic, which has been a bit bad for Burma, but a lot of people, civil society, I was among them, and political parties have entreated her to at least postpone the elections, delayed for a month or so, and she wouldn't listen to it. Of course, they submitted that to the Union Elections Commission. Please remember, all the commissions in Myanmar are not independent. When the incumbent comes in, it packs the commissions with its own people. The Human Rights Commission, Anti-Corruption Commission, Elections Commissions, whatever. So do not expect the Union Elections Commission to be not independent or non-partisan. It's a big disappointment. All the cancellations that they carried out in Rakhine, in Shan State, where the ethnic parties are strong, in Kachin, Kia, and KM. So it's going to be a bit interesting to watch. But as I've said, the NLD has made preparations, put certain structures in place. You can call it sleight of hands, It happens in many democracies. You see that in the West too, that they are not illegal, but they are not fair either. What the Elections Commission has done. So is well prepared for that. And the NLE is full of people who know this business, and they want to be re-elected again. There are perhaps 100,000 people who are on the payroll because of the NLD, and who are enjoying all the perks because of the NLD. They're not going to give up power easily. So what I personally have been hoping for is to have a coalition, NLD plus the ethnic parties, and some other small parties, so we can get our voices together. One of the main drawbacks of Myanmar democracy at the moment is that it is not plural, it is not inclusive, it is not consultative. One party is calling all the shots, and in that party, I'm sorry to say, one person is calling all the shots. Okay? So the youth know it, they're entering the elections emphatically. The ethnics know it, and some of the other parties know it. But the NLD being as strong as it is, there's not much thing to do about it. No. Okay, that's it. Now. And what implications does this have for Myanmar beyond the formation of a new government? And with the NLD in it. The first thing is that the chance for peace and federalism, which you must remember in a multi-ethnic, diverse country like Myanmar, is closely tied to democracy. If you talk about democracy transition, you can't talk without bringing in federalism. And this issue of peace, 70-year-old civil war, the chances for that have been reduced, let's say. It's sad, that not only with the ethnic parties, but with the ethnic armed organizations, NLD, and the Aung San Suu Kyi relations declining. That's too bad. Now, we have to bring in the Rohingya issue. One of the things that happened last year was that Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague in person, to the International Court of Justice, and to defend her country with the lawyers. She was sending a signal to the army that I'm here to defend you. It was the army that committed all those alleged atrocities. If I'm not around, you'll be in trouble. And that is her winning card. So at the moment, the NLD will have to, whether they like her or not, to tacitly accept her. So for the moment, you see, I was even telling some of your friends that Myanmar is now, one whole. The civil and military are together. So for countries like India and China also, it makes it a bit easier. You don't have to go to the military, you don't have to go to the NLD separately. People can think of things together. Now, whether these elections could have any implications for all the Rohingyas, going to take a lot of doing. Still, Aung San Suu Kyi has given 2 token seats to the Muslims, one in Yangon and one in a town near Mandalay. Others, the Rohingya candidates, have been disqualified. And again, it's a Union Elections Commission. They think up all these little bureaucratic quibbles, saying that your father or your mother wasn't a full citizen when you were born. And so those poor guys have been disqualified. I came back from Rakhine on the same flight as one of them. it was the last flight before it closed down because of COVID. So I think it took that time. What we need is now. Forget all the other states. Rakhine. No?
Okay, just 1 minute more.
Rakhine, that war in northern Rakhine is the war that we need the least. We don't like wars, but this was totally unexpected and totally unnecessary. Now, if we have an ANP chief minister, there will be more credibility. And even now, one of the unexpected byproducts of this turmoil is that the Rohingya and the Buddhist Arakanese have got together. It was totally unexpected Nobody thought this could happen, but it's happening. So at least there are some leads that we can follow up, but it will really have to be done with a plural setting and not with the NLD doing it alone. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khin Zaw Win. That was excellent. I think I think you clarified a lot of things for us, and I think you posed a very interesting question right at the. So I don't want to take up time of our panelists. I would now turn to Pradip Phanjoubam for his presentation, and we'll come down to the question and answer session towards at the end. Pradip?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I just want to take off from one of the points that the earlier speaker, Khin Zaw Win, flagged about this possible coalition between the NLD and the ethnic parties. And he was speaking of it as if this will happen only if it is inevitable. NLD doesn't get the majority, so it wants to get the majority, so bring in the thing. And I want to just start off from a point here, that even if the NLD gets the majority, which probably, according to the information that I gather and also the impression that so many journalists and NGO workers get, is that the NLD is going to be back in power, at least with the majority. But what I'm suggesting here is that even if it gets that majority, or even an absolute majority, it should still think of allying with the ethnic states, ethnic parties. For we're not just talking about the pragmatic aspect of politics, of winning, or the Machiavellian thing of winning first and all that whichever way you want. I mean, whichever means you use, you win. That kind of an approach is very much there in politics, but also I think we should rise above that. But I think, especially for Myanmar, is for it to rise above that. So if Aung San Suu Kyi gets the majority, you should still think of those alliances, because that's a long-term kind of victory that you're aiming at. And here I would like to refer to what John Paul Luttrell and so many others have written about the moral imagination. We're talking about the victory, immediate victory, but we want to go beyond that. That's a moral kind of a march, and we want to conquer morally, conquer or ally, or whatever you call it. Maybe I use the wrong term when I say conquer, but the base idea is that you sometimes these conflicts. The man I refer to, the author I refer to, John Paul Luttrell, he's actually a conflict scholar. So he said that sometimes, and he gives a number of examples in African conflicts and all that. And he says that sometimes a sincere hug can actually solve a lot of problems, much more than just power sharing and all that. That has to come about. But the initial breaking of ice can be done by a handshake. Sometimes a handshake is much more. There's a situation in one example he gives in his book. The book is also called Moral Imagination, where two villages were about to go to war. This is an African situation. The chief of one is a young man, and the other one is an elderly guy. So what happened was they were about to go to war, and this young man, that immoral exercise of that moral imagination, he came to that elder chief. You're like my dad. He just prostrated before him. You give me whatever punishment you want to give, then I will take it because you're an elder. That kind of approach. And the elder also melted down, and he said, no, nobody is going to touch my son. He even warned his army, everybody, and the war was ended that way. It's just an example that he was illustrating, that sometimes this moral imagination is absolutely essential in the resolution of conflicts. And so I think Daw Aung San Suu Kyi is quite capable of it. The 21st century Panglong conference that Ambassador was talking about was also about this, that you're reaching out. You're not talking about those pragmatic politics of who wins and who you sideline and all that. It's just a show of trust, generosity, and also that dropping of all the suspicions, that you don't have to be doing all that and still come out winning together. And I think that is where Myanmar must start. And also from the information that I gather from Myanmar, especially journalists and the NGO workers, and also friends, that it's going to be the NLD again, and it's going to be near about 70, and some are even, Mizima, for instance, says that it can go up right up to 80. If there's realignment, it's going to be the ethnic parties rising, and it's not going to, NLD is not going to lose out any of the other national parties or the larger parties. It will lose out to the ethnic parties. I think last time won about 12.2%. This time, according to Myanmar, it can rise up to 20. It can, but it doesn't have it, but it can. And Aung San Suu Kyi, he says that 70 is more or less a short, 70%. Last time it was 77.4 or something. And it can even beat that because the other parties are no alternative for the NLD, NLD can actually come out with that absolute majority. And that is where I wanted to make this point strongly, that even if there is a majority, NLD's objective must go beyond just that majority and also think of the ethnic states, because that's where the biggest problem, Myanmar's biggest problem is at the moment. Having said this, now I want to go to another point where people are talking about why has it come to this? Why has Myanmar come to this? Why is the 2008 constitution the way it is? Why is this such a centralist kind of constitution? And here I would like to just cite another example, but not written on Myanmar, but about the idea of independence, how Myanmar got its independence from the British, how India and Pakistan did the same, Ireland, etc. A.J. Noorani, he's got a book called The India-China Boundary Problem. There he was talking about how some of these problems that we're seeing now is in the manner of these former colonies becoming decolonized. In the case of India and Pakistan, it was a transfer of power. That you have the British, they had a system, and that system was actually transferred to the inheritors in Pakistan and India. And they had to do it because it's also going to become two countries, so they had to find ways to share whatever legacies or the resources that came down. And the two countries had to do it. So it was a transfer of power. In the case of Ireland, it was again a transfer of power, but the Irish people, they elected their own parliament, and that parliament dissolved the old system and started a new one. But that's irrelevant. But what is interesting is in the case of Myanmar, where it was not a transfer of power, but just the end of paramountcy. The British were there, we end our thing here, then you look after yourself. So Myanmar had to start from the scratch. They had to build its own constitution, you can borrow from others, but it's not a transfer of power. You didn't, at that point in 1948, you didn't have rule of law. There's no law, institutionalized law as such, you had to build it, so you didn't have that law. So you began on a chaotic kind of an environment that you had to be making law at that moment. You didn't have anything to follow because there was no transfer of power. And if anybody was actually trying to push those laws that the British made, it didn't have the legitimacy. So everybody was claiming their own and all that. So they started off in a very chaotic kind of environment. And I think Shelby Tucker has done a good book on this, Burma, The Curse of Independence, where he was actually saying that people were welcoming 1960 to take over because it was in such a chaotic state. You know, the Chinese, this Kuomintang, two divisions of the Kuomintang were actually stationed there in the Shan state, and the central government was not able to do anything. And then all kinds of foreign agencies, CIA included, because they had a fight with the communists, they were using this as a base. So they were walking in and out. So there was hell of a state of insecurity amongst the public, and also the fear that the country may disintegrate. So when in such a state, it was easy for the military to come in. And people, according to my readings, the people were actually welcoming it in the beginning, thinking that this was going to be a temporary kind of thing, arrangement to make sure that Myanmar remains intact. And then later on, disengaged, and the military would walk out on its own, which didn't happen, which can probably never happen when it comes to talk of power. Power normally is in love with itself, that you are in power, you don't want to let go. That kind of thing is happening. And that's where the history of democracy thing is. You know, that the insecurity that was there, the military came in, and even the 2008 constitution has a bit of this insecurity embedded in it, that the center had to be strong. It has to be a centralized kind of a quality. Otherwise, there is a danger of the country splitting, and that kind of awareness or apprehension, subliminally, maybe not consciously, but subliminally, there's always a fear that this will disintegrate. So these things are built. Now it's time for that same moral imagination to actually think beyond these insecurities. And just to highlight this insecurity I was talking about, the subliminal insecurity that a nation can suffer. And I would take a case of India again. Fali Nariman has done a good book on this issue, the state of the nation. There is a chapter on federalism where he was talking about the same thing, that you have in the Indian Constitution, you have Article 1, 2, 3. Article 1 gives you the indication that India is going to be a federation. That is, that is Bharat, will be a union of states. So all the states will come together and form it. Second one shows that India, acknowledges that India is still in incomplete story of time, that it can incorporate more territory, that Sikkim became a part of India by the second article of the Constitution. And the third article is what Halina Rimon was saying. This is the article which, Article 3 says that the center, with or without the consent of the states, can actually break up a state, tear it apart, join two states, change the name of the state and all that. And this was actually a warning to the princely states, because at the time of independence, India was also a very unsure kind of a nation where you have 600 or 500 and something princely states, many of them not willing to join or reluctant to join. So the Article 3 was actually a warning to the princely states that if you don't behave, I can change your name, I can abolish you. That kind of a message was being given by Article 3. I mean, the stated objective is different. Yeah, Pradip, yes. My time is up. Okay. Let me just conclude then that I would, on this same point about the moral imagination, that it has to come about. And briefly, if you give me 2 minutes, I'll just touch on the question of the Rohingya and the apprehension that Myanmar as well as Rakhine, how they are both having the same kind of apprehension, the same kind of attitude towards the Rohingyas. And also, although the objective is similar, the inner dynamics are different, a little different. And again, I will take the example of India, what is happening on the other side of the lane. That we have a CAA. This is quite similar to, I mean, it's not so aggressive and raw as what is happening in the Rohingya thing, but it's also happening here. And the protest against the CAA, like the difference between how the Myanmar government sees it and Rakhine sees it, that kind of difference is again there in the CAA. That in the rest of the nation, if there is objection to the CAA, it's about democratic norms and all that. But in the Northeast, again, if you come, Assam especially, it's not so much about democracy. It's saying that you cannot leave out some people. I mean, the other part of the nation is saying you cannot do this to anybody. And in the Northeast, people are saying you have to do it, but you can't leave out some people. That's the kind of difference. So I think here, I think we have to look at the problem. I mean, we're not justifying what happened, the consequences, but we have to look at the underlying causes of why people are thinking that way. Unless we are able to think that, see the motives behind these aggressions, we will not be able to come to any kind of meaningful resolution. Thank you very much. I wish I had more time to elaborate on this point, but let me conclude here. Maybe in the discussion I can say more.
Thank you, Pradeep. I think some very, very interesting points. But I just want to, to bring in one point as a question right now, which we can discuss later. Something that links Khin Zaw Win's and yours, which is this whole question about, you say that even if you actually put out your neck a little and say that the NLD will come back with an absolute majority, which I think slightly differs from Khin Zaw Win, but you're saying that even if they do, they should reach out to the ethnic parties. And of course, Khin Zaw Win is a bit pessimistic about that, because I think he sees it as a much more Burma-centric and, centralized system that continues with the NLD. So my question here to Khin Zaw Win is, does Aung San Suu Kyi have it in her DNA to have this moral imagination to reach out to the ethnic parties? And if she did, why did she not concede Rakhine to the ANP, as you yourself suggested? And why should she exercise this moral imagination at this late stage? I think another interesting point that Pradip raised was this whole issue of how insecurity has perhaps fed into military rule, and then actually also remains a very deeply felt subliminal fear in Myanmar, and that behind a lot of the centralizing tendencies and even perhaps a lot of the Burma anxieties, I think this is a kind of shadow that remains. So I think, on those 2 points, as well as the last point about the other, which I think is the point that Pradip in a way is reflecting on this issue of the other and the whole issue of migration, which is behind perhaps the CA issue in the Northeast, as well as the Rohingya issue, real or imagined, in Rakhine State. So I think our next speaker is particularly well positioned to be able to discuss and deal with all these things, both the center state issues that have been raised, as well as the issue of migration and otherness that we are seeing not only in Myanmar. Dr. Nehginpao Kipgen, you have written extensively on these subjects, including Much Closer Home. The floor is yours. We are starting at 4:21, 12 minutes, so that we have enough time for Dr. Mishra as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Gautam, and also thank you, ICWA. Particularly, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Samatha for putting this panel together. Of course, Pradip and Khin Zaw Win and Rahul, good to see you all on this panel. I would like to start a little bit of academic exercise in the beginning, if you allow me. Then, of course, I'll come to analysis based on this democratization theory, because in this semester I'm teaching my students democratization theory. So I just want to start off this presentation with democratization theory. Donald Scheer, in his article, Transition to Democracy and Transition to Transaction, talks about 4 different types of democratization theories. And 4 different types of transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And I would like to focus on the last one, which is transition to transaction. Transition to transaction, which involves consensual transition. What does it mean by consensual transition is that it can manifest in 2 ways. Consensual transition, first, is that authoritarian leaders may simply tolerate democratic political change by refraining from active stewardship. Second, by actively participating in the process of change by controlling or limiting the change. So, and consensual transitions entail some degree of political continuity between authoritarianism and democratic period. Such transitions avoid open confrontation between supporters of authoritarian rule and democratic rule. Okay, this is something that I would like to use as a theory and a foundation to analyze the 5 years of NLD's rule in Myanmar through the process of democratization. So here, in the case of Myanmar, it is more toward the second type of transition, whereby we see that the leaders are, when we say leaders, authoritarian leaders are actively participating in the process of change by controlling or limiting the change. And of course, we see a continuity of political authoritarianism in the new democratic setup. That's why we see some of the earlier speakers talk about cohabitation. In fact, in a political science terminology, we call that a hybrid regime. So we see a hybrid regime happening in Myanmar. So taking that into a foundation, and I would like to now look at 4 issues, 4 topics that matters to Myanmar's democratization process in the last 5 years. First, I would like to look at the Rohingya crisis, which we all touched upon a little bit of it, and also would like to look at the peace process with the country's ethnic minorities, and a constitutional amendment, and finally, economy. I would like to touch upon 4 aspects of Myanmar's democratization process. So, of course, the Rohingya crisis, as we all know, it has been the single most international criticism of the NLD government in the past few years, and it's and among others, Myanmar is under scrutiny by the International Court of Justice and ICC over the issue. There was a great expectation from Aung San Suu Kyi and her government to deliver some concrete solutions. However, apart from signing a bilateral agreement with Bangladesh on repatriation and memorandum of understanding with 2 UN agencies, UNHCR and UNDP, there has not been much progress on the ground. The new government has the chance to amend some of its international image during the upcoming election, but this seems to be a far cry now. In fact, the Union Election Commission, some of you have touched upon this issue, has disqualified these Rohingya candidates, in fact, Muslim candidates, One of such victims was A. Win of the Democracy and Human Rights Party from the Rakhine State, who was disqualified in the first week of October, although he had been declared eligible earlier. There is a general negative perception of the Rohingyas, especially among the Mama or Burman majority ethnic group, as interlopers, and therefore should not be accepted as full citizens of Myanmar. This view is widely shared by many in the NLD government. Even though they are not publicly talking about this, they are supportive of this idea. Despite the severe criticism from the international community, including human rights groups, many voters still have faith that Aung San Suu Kyi and our NLD government will address this issue. This is something that we can debate during the question and answer session. One evidence of such support were the massive rallies during the ICS hearing late last year, and the grand reception the State Council received upon her return from The Hague. So the point that I'm trying to make is that despite strong international criticism over the Rohingya issue, there is still a strong support from the Burmese citizens, especially from the ethnic Burma or the majority Burma or Burman population. And now I would like to come to the peace process or peace settlement. When the NLD came to power in 2016, one of its publicly announced priorities was peace with the ethnic armed groups through the nationwide ceasefire agreement, which was initiated by the USDP government in 2011. The USDP government under President Thein Sein was able to reach a ceasefire agreement with 8 ethnic armed groups, as they believed that it was serious about finding a solution to the decades-old armed conflict in the country. For example, President Thein Sein made a pledge to make the issue of ethnic minorities a national priority by dropping the demand made by the previous military government that all ethnic armed groups become border guard forces. Moreover, the government was willing to enter talks with the armed groups without any preconditions, which was not the case during the military regime. There was a lot of expectation from the NLD government, which championed the pro-democracy agenda since the military years, since its formation in 1988. Despite giving a considerable amount of effort and time, the government was only able to bring on board 2 armed groups, the New Mon State Party and the Lahore Democratic Union. While the government and the military insisted on signing a bilateral agreement as a pathway to the NCA, the armed groups demanded that the government declares a nationwide ceasefire that will cover all armed groups. Moreover, the NLD government and the military has been unwilling to engage all armed groups, especially the Arakan army, which has engaged in ongoing armed conflicts. Alarmingly, what is alarming is that this has led to a bigger and stronger Arakan army and more ongoing armed conflicts between the armed group and the Myanmar security forces in parts of Rakhine and Chin states. And the more glaring development is the extrajudicial killings and the increasing number of IDPs. But despite the NLD government's failure to make significant progress, it continues to show a commitment toward finding a durable solution with the country's ethnic minorities. For instance, among other initiatives, and the NLD government organized the 4th session of the Union Peace Conference of the 21st Century Panglong in August this year. This year's conference closed with the signing of the 3rd part of the Union Accord. Many voters, still seem to believe that the NLD government can take the peace process forward. Definitely, this is a very sad and a very disappointing progress on the part of the minorities. But still, there are many people who believe that NLD is there. Is willing and has made the commitment or has shown the commitment to take the peace process forward. And now I would like to come to constitutional amendment. One of other priority for the NLD government is a constitutional amendment. To its credit, NLD has put forward amendment proposals including reducing the role of the military in politics, abolishing the military's right to take power during national emergency, and preventing anyone with a foreign spouse or children from becoming president. Unfortunately, the military representatives in the National Parliament were united in opposing most of these proposals, though they were willing to support a constitutional amendment that would allow states and regions to choose or elect their own chief ministers. In fact, with the support of military-appointed lawmakers and ethnic parliamentarians, the Operation GSP sponsored such a bill in March 2020 to amend Article 261B, which gave the President the power to appoint chief ministers in Myanmar's 14 states and regions. However, here's the important, but however, the NLD government did not support this constitutional amendment, without which the bill did not receive more than 75% support required in the parliament to pass. Had the constitution been amended, it would have given more power to ethnic minorities to choose their own leaders. The NLD government blames the military and its supporters for failing to bring wide-scale amendments to the constitution and promises to try again if elected to power. Many voters will undoubtedly believe and continue to support such largely empty promises. That's what I call largely empty promises. And now finally to the point of economy. Economic development was one other major agenda of the NLD government, but as per the World Bank update made released on October 2nd this year, last month, when Myanmar opened up to the international community in 2011 during the USDP government, there was a rapid economic growth of above 7% per year, and there were considerable improvements in social welfare. And the poverty rate was almost half, falling from 48% to 25% between 2005 and 2017. However, the economic growth momentum slowed down after the NLD government came into power in 2016 as it grappled with its economic vision and management strategies. The government could not create a conducive, safe, and convenient environment to attract foreign business and investments. For example, investors were wary of obsolete or inadequate regulations such as laws on foreign ownership, as well as insufficient infrastructure, primarily electricity, port infrastructure, and inland transport to boost manufacturing and supply chain activity. The government's handling of the Rohingya issue was also a cause for concern for potential investors. In an attempt to address the situation, the government initiated an ambitious Myanmar Sustainable Development Plan, which got disrupted in part by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the economy is expected to contract by as much as 2.5% for the fiscal year 2019-2020. Moreover, the International Monetary Fund in its July 7 update said that economic growth had already been slowing down when the pandemic hit the country. Though the economy is not doing well, this may change once the pandemic is over, and more importantly, if and when the government has the policy and strategy that is friendly and transparent to both local and foreign investors. Finally, I just like to touch upon the role of minority groups or ethnic minority groups, especially in the minority areas or ethnic states. The NLD may likely face tougher election competition in areas dominated by ethnic minorities than the last election in 2015. Unlike the 2015 election, the minorities have taken certain steps to stand united in the upcoming November 8 election. One example is the merger of several smaller parties into 6 major groups: the Kachin State People's Party, the Kaya State Democratic Party, the Karen National Democratic Party, the Chin National League for Democracy, the Mon Unity Party, and the In National Development Party last year. The ethnic minorities party's inability to form a strong alternative to the NLD in the past has been due to a lack of unity among themselves. The coalition of parties may have allowed them to win more seats in the national parliament, state and regional legislatures. However, as the tricky part, however, a possible strong performance of ethnic parties has been hampered by the cancellation of elections in Rakhine, Kachin, Sham, Kazin, Kayin, and Mon states by the Union Election Commission on October 16. But despite the NLD government's, see, my main argument is that I have so far discussed the weaknesses or the missteps of the NLD government in the past 5 years. Despite the consensual transition that we see in democratization theory, my argument is that despite the NLD government's missteps or failures on major issues that matter to the country and voters, the party is likely to secure a majority in the national parliament. I'm talking about in the national parliament. Many voters, especially from the majority Burma ethnic group, which forms almost, I'm almost done. Which forms almost 2/3 of the total population, still believe Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD are the most formidable, and viable party to challenge the military establishment, as well as the party to stand up against international criticism and pressure. The bottom line, however, is that even if the NLD wins a majority, the election may not usher in a significant change with regard to the consolidation of democracy, so long as the military, which among others hold 25% of seats in all legislatures, wields considerable influence on Myanmar's politics. But I don't want to put blame entirely on the military. I think we should, as informed scholars and observers, we should also put heavy blame on NLD for doing too little, too slow toward the consolidation of democracy in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nehginpao. Once again, another excellent presentation. And I think your basic point is that there has not been much significant change. I think there's a common current. And also a sense of drift, really not much sense of achievement, really very little achieved in the last 5 years as well. But the question that I have for you, please, Mark, for the discussions, is do you think Daw Aung San Suu Kyi missed an opportunity? I'm referring to the juxtaposition of the peace process and the economy. Do you think she made a mistake by prioritizing the peace process rather than the economy immediately after the elections? Had she perhaps tackled the low-hanging fruit of economic reforms, bringing benefit to the people, and then addressing the peace process and the ethnic issue? To some extent, in addressing the ethnic issue first, she also played into the hands of China, which held a leverage with many of the ethnic armed organizations that were still fighting. And so this question, I think I'll leave hanging for the time being, but please, I would like you and Khin Zaw Win also to answer this question, whether she missed an opportunity by not addressing the economy as a first priority rather than the peace process, and kept the peace process going and picked it up with the improvement of the economy. Anyway, I think you have raised also a number of points: the peace process, the economy, the role of the minorities, center-state relations, and the whole issue of the Rohingyas. I think these are common issues. I now turn to Dr. Rahul Mishra. You have 12 minutes. I'd like you to address anything that you think has been left out of the discussion. And in particular, I think on this whole question of whether the NLD government in the last 5 years has shown more drift than imagination.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by thanking Ambassador Raghavan and his ICWA team, particularly Dr. Nivedita and Dr. Samatha, for giving this opportunity. This webinar is very timely. But I also wonder how many other Indian think tanks are planning or doing this kind of event. The Southeast Asian studies, unfortunately, in India is a very marginalized, underappreciated field, which also explains partly the academic exile, as it were, mine. So I'm really delighted to be a part of this webinar, and I thank ICWA for this wonderful planning. I guess much ground has already been covered, and there is a consensus of sorts amongst the participants, the panelists, that NLD is certainly going to win. It is not going to be a clean sweep, a repeat of what had happened earlier, but certainly it is going to be a majority for the NLD. In terms of forming a government, of course, coalition is a possibility, but even in that coalition, NLD is certainly going to hold sway. It is going to hold the predominant position. Other players, I don't know how effective they would be. So, in effect, it is going to be NLD 2.0 with NLD government 2.0 with new players, but playing only marginal roles, and a partnership, the most effective partnership, pivotal partnership would really be between the NLD and the USDP, because 25% seats are with them. Any fundamental, substantial change that you are looking at in Myanmar in next 5 years is going to be with the partnership of these two players. So what I am trying to do is I would try to avoid repetitions. And I think in that context, there are two issues which still demand our attention. One is looking at the Myanmar election from the regional Southeast Asian point of view. And I'll just give you a little story that happened with me. I was sharing this with one of my colleagues in Malaysia, and I told her that look, there is this webinar I'm going to participate in, and it's going to be on Myanmar elections. And her single only point was, why don't you waste your time watching some good movie if you're not doing, anything substantial? The point here is that in the Southeast Asian region, elections in Myanmar is really considered a sham. I'm sorry about it, but Malaysians are not very sorry about it. And this is the impression that has been there across the board. You talk to anybody in Indonesia or in Brunei, Philippines, Singapore would be more, I would say, more diplomatic in responding. So overall, the regional impression is that Myanmar, nothing has changed in 5 years, and nothing fundamentally is going to change in next 5 years. And that's the essence of it. But because Myanmar is part of the ASEAN mechanism, ASEAN has welcomed it, and they are open to this idea of Myanmar, democracy in Myanmar flourishing. But let us take a look at the regional context here. I think regionally, in the Southeast Asian region, democracy is going through a rather rough phase. What is happening in Thailand should worry us all. Malaysia too has been going through a period of uncertainty. And Tuanku, the King Gong himself, had to intervene a couple of times, exercise his authority, and ensure stability in the country. In Cambodia, the opposition is being marginalized and oppressed, which has led to a lot of criticism for Hun Sen and his government. The European Union has taken, I don't know how many of us in India, the think tankers are following it. European Union has taken measures to basically punish Hun Sen by stopping the EBA scheme, the everything but arms. And China has taken made good use of that opportunity, and they've signed an FTA with them. So it's democracy game there again. One really doesn't have to talk about Duterte. What he's been up to is very clear to everybody. So all in all, if we look at the Southeast Asian picture, the regional canvas, it is a very hopeless situation overall. And one is not very hopeful of what is happening in the US either, right? Liberals are talking about counting valid votes, and the Republicans are only interested in making sure that those votes are not counted. So this, my first point is not a very good period for democracy. And in such a gloomy phase of nation states, I think it's a good news that Myanmar is going through something like this. We must remember the fact that for a country which has been under the clutches of military junta for decades, there are practically no institutions, right? And so holding an election right after the previous one, back to back, this is the second election, is not a small achievement. And that the democratic elections are being held for the second time and on time, without any major upheavals or discord between the two most important pillars, that is NLD and Tatmadaw, I think it deserves some appreciation. I absolutely agree with Khin Zaw Win's point. I think he had made very interesting observations last time when we met in Berlin at the Euroseas. But the point here really is that elections are important. This is a good news for Myanmar. And it is important simply because this restoring democracy was the single biggest source of discord and dispute between, and not only between NLD and Tatmadaw, but also between Myanmar and international community. Go back to all the literature, thousands of op-ed pieces that were published before 2015. We were all talking about, bringing the procedural democracy into the country, right? So in terms of democratic process, I believe at least the first stage is clear. From the deadlock, the situation unfortunately has moved to what can be termed as gatekeeping. That is, two principal players now trying to obstruct opportunities or avenues for other players, smaller parties, minority communities, ethnic parties, and so on and so forth. But these are also things that we had expected. We knew that past 5 years, we knew that this is something that's going to happen. And in next 5 years also, I don't think this is going to change fundamentally. Third world democracies, post-colonial societies, these are natural phenomena. where charismatic leadership, if there is not, you look for nepotism, right? You look for dynasty politics to make sure that even the small little birds of democracy are there. Myanmar at this moment does not have those other pillars that can sustain democracy, and that's why I think not having institution is the bigger problem, rather than saying that it's just NLD or Aung San Suu Kyi. We have to understand and appreciate that Aung San Suu Kyi all by herself could not do much, and I think the chair has already pointed that out, that whether it was a good idea to look for national ethnic reconciliation or economic reforms. There's so many other issues. And in 5 years' time, I think we'd be a little harsh on Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD if we expect her to do everything else. Now, another question that I think would demand our attention is how's India been looking at it? And what is India's interest and stake? I think for India, Aung San Suu Kyi has always been important, NLD has been important, but at the same time, Tatmadaw has also been a very reliable friend, especially in dealing with the insurgents and dealing with cross-border activities, insurgent activities. So for India, it has had no option but to maintain balance, because border security and defense fall under the purview of Tatmadaw by proxy, right? And their support is crucial in maintaining peace and stability. Suu Kyi is mindful of that, and also Indian policymakers are mindful of that. And that explains why there was this recent visit by Foreign Secretary Mr. Shringla and General Navane. Really a rare moment in India's diplomatic history where the Chief of Army Staff goes with the Foreign Secretary to a country. So that explains, if visits are any signal to your diplomatic movements or diplomatic moves that you make, I think this gives us a very clear signal that for India, it is maintaining balance between the military forces and also the democratic forces, the leading democratic force, that is NLD. So that perhaps gives us the signal.
2 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Just sure. I think you're finishing anyway.
I think India has so far no objection to the fact that there is, as long as there is a due process of law and rule of law followed in Myanmar, we are more or less okay, and that is why India has not been very critical of what has been happening. India also believes that backseat driving democracy in neighborhood has not been a good idea. It has always backfired. And that's why this belief is not guided by interventions and unnecessary influence. Pragmatism has been the guiding principle for India's policy moves in Myanmar, and that I believe is a positive contributor. Now, for next 5 years, perhaps, once the government comes in power, that is where India's role would take more salience. You have to first build, and you have to really strengthen the pillars of democracy. Institutions that matter, they have to be nurtured in next 5 years. And then maybe 2025, we can go a little more critical of Myanmar government and say, look, you have these institutions like Mr. Khin Zaw Win mentioned, also Dr. Pradip mentioned that those institutions, for example, the Chief of Election Commission or the Auditor General, their roles, the observers, local ones, other parties, their representation, all these things are important. But once this pattern is established, then perhaps we can pin more hopes on how democracy should function in Myanmar. And also India can perhaps play a bigger role in strengthening those institutions, and then asking for more delivery on the democratic part from Myanmar. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their really very interesting presentations. I think all of you have given new dimensions and new layers to the issue. So let me, I think, just give a sense of the summary. Dr. Samatha, in the meantime, if you could kindly collect also any questions that may have been coming from the audience. But let me just lead it by saying a couple of things. The sense that I get is that unlike 2015, there's not much of a story in this election. At the best, you may see a little surprise. I think that Khin Zaw Win says is that maybe the NLD does not come with an absolute majority. It is obliged to form coalitions, perhaps with the with the ethnic states. Rahul Mishra actually suggested that it may have to be a partnership between the NLD and the USDP. So one question that logically throws up, is the USDP likely to do better? Is it likely to improve its count in the Myanmar parliament this year? That's one question. Second, on this whole issue of the Rohingya, there are two questions that come to my mind. Firstly, where do you see this ICJ process going? As has been pointed out by someone, that as a whole, the Myanmar people, at least the Burma majority, stands behind both the army and Daw Aung San Suu Kyi on the castigation that it is getting from the international community on the Rohingya issue. This is not much of an internal issue. There is no division inside, by and large, on this. And the second question is, what are the hopes of the Rohingya community ever coming back? Is there ever any likelihood of the Rohingya community coming back, one way or the other? And if it doesn't, then what are the prospects and courses? What trajectory is that whole issue likely to take? Rahul, you talked a lot about the institutionalization of democracy. On the institutionalization of democracy and India's position, I think India has been quite agnostic on democracy. What it has basically sought, to the extent that it has any influence, is to see whether parties or elements are pro-India or anti-India, or which of them is more likely to be with India. And so long that issue, and given the other international issues, maybe somewhere it's Pakistan, maybe somewhere it's China, I think India has basically looked out for its interests from that point of view, and it has been quite pragmatic about that. And in the case of Myanmar, I don't think that is an issue, because whether it is the armed forces or it is the civilian political parties, their relationship with India is not contingent on China or vice versa. So I don't think we are put into a situation of having to choose between democracy or something else. We can live with both. We prefer something, but maybe we can live with both. And we don't see the need to really intervene in that process very, very strongly. So I think...
Absolutely. We are on the same page there. Sorry to interrupt. I thought we are on the same page there.
Yeah. No, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that, I'm just sort of presenting what seems to be a pragmatic position there. And then I think I already asked some questions earlier, whether we missed an opportunity, whether NLD missed an opportunity by not addressing the economy first, whether it is in Daw Aung San Suu Kyi's DNA to be able to come up with an imaginative solution to the political and economic problems, particularly the issue of federalism and the rights of the ethnic states. Whether in fact such a thing is available elsewhere. Is it available elsewhere in the body politic? Are there new politicians? Are there old politicians who are thinking fresh? Could Thura Ushre Man, be an alternative? Could Kokoji or some other element that we don't know as of now? Could the next parliament throw up interesting new leaderships? I think these are some of the questions that I think I would like to put before you, and all of you are welcome to address whichever you wish. So, yeah, Dr. Samatha.
Yeah. I'd like to make a few observations before we take up the Q&A. Yes. Thank you, sir. Thank you, panelists, for very informative and critical presentations made about the upcoming elections in Myanmar. I have very few broad observations to make. One is that if you look at the various reports in the newspapers and about the upcoming elections in Myanmar, there's a lot of debate going on about whether this election is free and fair, or is it fundamentally flawed because of the restrictions imposed on media and the non-participation of various ethnic minorities in this election. So the current debate is, I think, just in contrast with how the elections in 2015 were viewed by the international community. The 2015 elections were held as a big departure from the past military rule, and the NLD, under the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi, was expected to take the country out of its political turmoil. Despite the contrast, I think, in expectations, as pointed out by the panelists, NLD, I think, is set to come back to power, maybe with a coalition or maybe not. Though it's not an inclusive election also. This is not an inclusive election also, it has pointed out by the Mr. Khin Zaw Win. Because firstly, there is no, I think NLD will come back to power probably because firstly, there is no other political alternative that can really mobilize people on broad issues of economy and ethnic religion required constitutional changes. And also there is no other, I think, political party which can actually counter to some extent Myanmar's military's influence on the administration of the country or can work maybe in the future with the Myanmar military. So this is where I think the NLD advantage lies. It's also pointed out by one of the panelists. I think, and this is where I think the military-backed, but at the same time, the military-backed USTP will have its own seats reserved for them as per the constitution, even if it fails to garner the votes of the majority. As a panelist, as pointed out by one of the panelists, that this year's NLD's election also pledges to protect the rights of ethnic minorities, just like the election manifesto of the last elections. It actually pledges to protect the rights of the ethnic minorities and to form a corruption-free government, and also it promised to establish a fair and impartial judiciary and a constitution that can ensure a genuine democratic federal union, and also it also talks about a sustainable development. So these are some unfulfilled promises and made by the NLD and yet to deliver under the leadership of the State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. So one of the important promises made also during this last election and this election is, as mentioned by our chair, is the Panglong Peace Conference that was supposed to address the basic political, economic, security issues among ethnic communities. I think this is where I think this is still to be achieved. Over the last 5 years, the internal developments in Myanmar also proved that taking ethnic minorities along in achieving democratic federal union is a very difficult exercise, mainly because the violence has become a norm in minority-dominated areas such as Rakhine, Kachin, Shan and Mon states. NLD government also could not do much in security-related matters, and the military has an advantage in this regard. And also, if you look at, as mentioned by the panelists, the whole or the partial cancellation of elections and restrictions imposed in these states, and I think also hamper any hope for minority parties to participate in the future peace negotiations and in decision-making process, even if the NLD comes to power in this election. As mentioned also by the panelists, that the constitutional amendments to reduce the role of the military as is another issue, I think, which is coming in the way of achieving democratic federal union. Initiatives taken at amending the constitution was blocked by the military, and there seems to be no easy way out. The government's handling of Rohingya issue and the international attention it has received, I think, only institutionalized military's role in society. Another important aspect is the economic recovery in post-pandemic scenario, and that is what also talked about in the discussion. That is that NLD is actually now promising the economy centered on public-private partnership to promote small businesses through public and also plan to liberalize the key sectors of the economy. And I think it remains to be seen how the internal situation along the borders will be marginalized or managed to stabilize the economy in the future. Finally, I would like to point out that the NLD government's rule in the last 5 years has also demonstrated that the difficulties in democratic transition in military ruled states, where the government had to manage the expectations of all the stakeholders and resulting in maybe taking a step back on important promises made. Maybe it has helped the NLD in gaining the confidence of the majority and will maybe help in winning the upcoming elections. However, as pointed out by the panelist, the number of uncertainties I think still remain in terms of economic recovery, inclusion of minorities in decision-making process, and military's role and clashes in frontier areas. And how the NLD is going to manage all these issues, I think, remains to be seen in the next 5 years. Thank you. Thank you, sir. These are the few observations I have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Samatha. I think that was really very comprehensive. I think you've taken excellent notes. My question now is, do we have any time left for discussion, or do we round it? In fact, I thought I would call you after that, but I'll be guided by you.
Sir, yeah, we have time, sir. We also have questions in the chat box. We can
right. So why don't if you have the questions, why don't you pose it so that we can do a round of answers. that include, whatever the questions are.
Okay. The question from Hableker, PM Hableker, sir. He's asking that how does the Buddhist clergy see the upcoming general elections? That is one question we have in the chat box. And another question is from Anshuman Chaudhary. Will NLD be interested in reviving the constitutional amendment process if it comes back to power with a majority? Or was it simply a pre-election ritual? Can there be a mutual compromise between the NLD and Tatmadava over the amendment process in the near future? That is another question. There is and one more question from Maheshwari. She's asking, would you say that we are moving towards a form of democracy in Myanmar where Rohingya will have no role to play in the next election, while democracy is indeed taking roots? It is not as one was expecting it to be. And one more question from the same participant. The second question is on the potential threat posed by Rohingya community members in the region. Are they being pushed to the wall, and could one expect them to take up arms in greater numbers to respond to the events and near silence of regional powers such as China and India? A question from the Chailen Datta. How does existence of Golden Triangle hamper the democratic transition in Myanmar, and what has the government done to counter that? The last question from Dr. Uday Banu Singh. He's asking, will the CMEC on one hand and the developments on the Indo-Pacific Joint Front have implications for Myanmar in the coming 5 years? So these are the questions we have right now.
So that's a lot of questions. The last one is a little geopolitical in nature. I think you have a good menu of questions to pick and choose from. We'll begin in the order that we invited the panelists. Khin Zaw Win perhaps first, Pradip after that, and Nehginpao and Rahul Mishra after that. Sorry, you're muted, Khin Zaw Win. You're muted. Unmute.
I'll do the questions from the audience first, and then I'll fall to the questions that you have posed. There are a few of them too. Yeah? Okay, now from the audience, I think the first one was for the Buddhist monks. Surprisingly, the Buddhist monks have been quiet recently. Today, I found a news item saying that Wirathu, who's absconding, he's to be arrested, has consented to be arrested, to give himself up. Yeah? We don't know, we haven't confirmed it, but I think he wants to get back into the political, arena. Now he's on the run. But on the whole, Buddhist monks have been very quiet. I don't know what they're doing. Second is from Anshuman Chaudhary. It's about the constitutional amendment. I think it will be put on hold for the moment because there are lots of items on the agenda for amendments, and people are even saying that, why don't we just scrap it and rewrite it altogether? We don't know. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi wants 56F repealed because she wants to be president. The ethnics want Article 261 because they want their own parties to appoint the chief minister. So there are people pulling in different directions, and Penlong is not the right forum to amend the constitution. I think we should do it properly. I think at least for the moment it'll be on hold, but whoever wins the elections, this issue will come up again. Thirdly, was about from the audience was about what are the Rohingya. Now let me tell you, we are moving towards a federal system. I've been to Rakhine before. I was in Rakhine just in August, just before the COVID second wave hit. I visited so many IDP camps. There are 2 lakh IDPs there, and the army and the navy are shelling civilian villages. Okay, nothing. Rakhine, the Arakanese, you go back to the old British name, Arakan. They want to solve their own problems themselves. They don't want the Burma to solve it for them. There's quite a lot of credence in that. So if we have a Rakhine chief minister, ANP, not the NLD. I'm sorry to say this, but the NLD chief minister is worse than useless. He's a liability. Okay, so just on the off chance that the ANP can appoint its own chief minister, that will be a definite move upwards. And if there is unfortunately, the Arakan army is branded as a terrorist organization. If they can come back into, let's say, circulation in a way, they can help too. They've been making some bold statements before. And finally, I went to visit the monasteries. The Arakanese monks are ready to play a role. They've seen that people suffer all the death and destruction and the lack of food. So, especially the younger monks, if they can be allowed to play a role, if they can all move together, we can find a solution, including for the Rohingya in Rakhine. Don't depend on Naypyidaw, please, please. I can say that to the ASEAN, to Dr. Mishra has been talking about ASEAN. Myanmar doesn't believe much in ASEAN. ASEAN doesn't believe much in Myanmar elections. It's mutual. So that is the thing for. Now, let me look at the other questions. The Golden Triangle. Well, I think it's outdated now. The action has come into northern Shan State, and it's not opium anymore. It's just the precursor chemicals, and they are producing methamphetamines. We don't need all the big paraphernalia. Even a small bit of room in the jungle can do that. So I think, no matter what, I think it's not a matter of the ethnic armed organizations. It's a matter for international criminal syndicates. So now, we are there. Okay. I'm just saying. There's one more. Wait. You want to wait some time. Now, the question said, Gautam Pros. In 2016, after the elections, the ANP just was one seat short of a majority in Rakhine. And they went in a team to Aung San Suu Kyi to plead for an ANP chief minister. She turned them down rudely and almost insulted them. You see? So there's no resolution in that. Unless it is Article 261 is repealed and revoked. Actually, you don't even need that, because it's done by the president. Appointment of chief ministers is done by the president. But the two presidents that we've had are mere puppets. What can they do with Aung San Suu Kyi? And that is one of the main structural problems we have with the democracy today under the NLD. Number two, the economy. Aung San Suu Kyi could have done both. She could have got advisors from abroad. There's one Australian professor who's advising her, and there are some able economists in Myanmar too. But she wants to do everything herself, Now, the situation is, I say, people don't like it. It's like a throwback to Nabon's time, that one person in Naypyidaw is calling all the shots, Now, what I am worried about now is that the post-COVID economic recovery, that is, China has not only gotten rid of COVID, its economy is working again. Now, we know the third quarter figures and all that, and the Chinese Communist Party just had a plenum recently. Aung San Suu Kyi could conceivably outsource Myanmar's recovery to China. We have to watch that, because she's actually not capable of that. Well, we have the IMF, we have all the international financial institutions. It's not rocket science, you can define that. But then, where is the muscle? Where's the money going to come from? So she could easily choose the easy way out and turn to China. USCP, I think it is still the second largest party now, and it'll make a good try. One party was, the UDP was also, deregistered. No, I'm saying the leader has a shady past. Okay, get rid of him, but you don't deregister the party because of that, and that's not fair, But it starts. I think the reason was that the NLD does not want all that competition, extra competition. The ICJ, the case of the ICJ will go on. Well, I don't know. Myanmar has to answer next July. I don't know how they will cope with it, but still, in that issue, the cohabitation between the NLD and the military will have to continue. They both need each other. I think that's about all of that. Rohingya, like I said, repatriation, I think basically depends on the Rakhine people resolving their problems together. There is an unexpected about face in that people have said, okay, we are all people from Rakhine. Don't make a distinction between the Buddhist Rakhine and the Rohingyas. There is a little coming together of the two peoples. Okay, I'll take that.
Well, thank you. Very sobering, but I think a little bit of hope at the end on the last point. Pradip, please feel free to pick and choose your question.
Okay, let me just sum up what is there in the chat box as well as what transpired during the discussions. So I would like to start with the cynicism about democracy as such, and democracy in particular when applied to Myanmar, that it has not worked, that it has not brought about economic development and all that. There's so many things not happening, and I also said in my presentation that there are so many roadblocks that Myanmar actually had to begin from scratch, that it didn't inherit any institution which can be relied upon or which has the kind of legitimacy that any democracy requires, that you have courts and education and whatever, that those institutions were totally missing in Myanmar when it started. But democracy has now come back, and still we are disputing whether it has actually worked. And I tend to look for articles and write-ups as well as opinions which show some bit of that optimism. And that optimism, according to some of these writers, or I would say quite a number of these writers and observers, is that there is a civil society building up. Now, we talk about only the tangible kind of thing, what's the GDP, all those things. But there are some intangible values which come along with democracy. And one of them is the idea of the press, freedom of speech, the idea of civil society, where you are not the government, but you are actually the ones who are going to shape the government. That kind of an attitude is actually coming back slowly to Myanmar. I think these are signs of optimism. In fact, one writer, Gordon Littner, has actually talked about this in one of his articles, saying that the civil society is right now, there's a younger generation of civil society actually growing in Myanmar, and they may be the ones who are bringing back that the light, to show the light to the future. So I think we shouldn't give up hope on democracy as such, and also on the question of economy and the ethnic issue, which comes first, which Gautam also raised. And here I would like to give an example. Tibet has development come there, yes. So much of money has been poured there. You have a rail line at high altitude with a special kind of engine and all kinds of things there. But are the Tibetans happy? That kind of question. I think we need to pose this kind of question as well. Is development everything about happiness or satisfaction or a contented society? Are problems resolved if only this is brought about? This is necessary, but I think there are some other things. So I think these are issues that have to be tackled simultaneously, that you have also addressed it. One does not exclude the other. You bring in development. That is your job. You're a government. You're supposed to do that. But you're also supposed to look after the other things, the other intangible aspects of society, of bring about contentment in the society. Those things are also equally important. So when you talk about democracy, I think we also have to be talking about those intangible values which have actually grown. And civil society, according to many, I have not been there for 2 years. I'm not traveling in Myanmar for 2 years, but according to many who are stationed there, and I've been speaking to them quite a lot, and also reading their assessment, and they feel that the growth of the civil society, independent civil society, is where the hope is. And I hope people who are in charge are able to make capital out of this. That is one of them. And then the question of Rohingya, I think, is coming up everywhere. And I was also going to talk in the earlier my presentation, where I was saying that the Rohingyas should go back to where they were offset from, and a modality has to be found. But at the same time, for this solution to be lasting and deep-rooted, we have to also look at what led to those kind of trouble, and to look at Rakhine. Also Khin Zaw also mentioned this. How they look at the problem. Why is it that the Myanmar government, Myanmar as such, is also looking at the Rohingya as migrants from Bangladesh? And if you look at and to understand this problem, I think it would be helpful for us if we just look across the border. That's the Chittagong Hill Tract, a strip of land which is inhabited by ethnic cousins of the Rakhines, the Chakmas and the Marmas and all that. And if you interview them, if you look at how they see this problem, probably they will see it as the Rakhine see it. That, and I bring this issue in with what people like Ganesh Devi says on the threatened languages of how cultural apprehensions of small communities has to be taken care of, has to be actually looked into more seriously before we think of solving these problems. If you look at the population of Bangladesh, if we for a moment, if we suspend everything else and believe with Rakhine that these are migrants, I mean, you may have original population there, but there are others coming in, which is why the population is growing. But if you look at it from that perspective, what is the population of the Rakhine? What is the population of Myanmar as such? 55 million. And we look across the border. If you look at it as a region, not just as a country. Within the country, Myanmar are the majority. They form 60% of the population of 55 million. But if you just take the entire region, bring it together with Bangladesh, Bangladesh has 164 million. Again, they are reduced to minority. So this idea of majorities with minority complex, I think, has a regional, or if you look at the broader canvas, these things make meaning. Why are the Rakhines, who are the majority in the Rakhine state, still fearful of others encroaching into their territory, whether it's Burma or from Bangladesh? I think if we have to understand what actually is going on in their mind, then I think,
just to wrap up.
Okay. This is all the point that I want to make, that democracy has its values. And also this one more point that the challenge to Aung San Suu Kyi, we are talking about USDP, and it has 23 allies. There are 93 political parties in the fray, and 23 of them are allied to USDP. This is what I get from the picture that I get from the reports from there. And these 23 allies are not going to make too much of an impact, and USDP may manage to retain that 10%. This is the thing. Report that I'm getting, and also from my instinct, I feel that way, that NLD is still going to be majority, maybe even alone, which is why I was putting that caveat that even if it is majority, it must still think larger than just the government. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pradip. Pradip makes the point about civil society. Nehginpao, do you think civil society can throw up an alternate leadership in the next parliament, let's say, or in the next election, after the next elections?
Before I answer that, Gautam, I just would like to reiterate the point that the transition that we see in Myanmar is a transition through transaction. So you see there is a give and take from the military and the NLD side. And coming to your question first, regarding had NLD government needs it's an opportunity not focusing solely on economy, I think definitely it can be done simultaneously. It can go parallel. Because on both fronts, NLD has made steps. For example, if you look at on the armed group or ethnic, the peace process, of course, there's a limitation difficulty from the side of the NLD and its government because the military still holds a lot of power when it comes to security matters. But what happens is that while you are negotiating some group, you are also fighting against others. You are isolating some groups and you're trying to bring on some. You're bringing on divide and rule policy. I mean, we keep blaming the military, but NLD is also somehow, I think, complicit to this notion of trying to do divide and rule within the ethnic minority. I think this is some of the biggest mistake that the government has done so far. And of course, in terms of economy, it's about mismanagement and lack of clear policy, which could attract foreign investors to come. Because Myanmar's economy largely depends on foreign investment. And when the foreign investors are not comfortable to come and invest, I mean, it's going to affect its economy. So Myanmar needs to have a clear policy, a transparent policy, whereby attracting foreign investors. Of course, Rohingya crisis is one very major issue which also, prevent or let's say discourage foreign investors to come in. And the second thing that I would like to address is that regarding whether the Rohingya people would take up arms in greater numbers. I think it depends. As long as the international community, including ICJ, ICC, and others are heavily engaged in the process, despite them being not able to return yet. As long as the international community is active on the issue, I do not believe that the Rohingya people are going to take up arms in greater number, because that's going to discredit about the international attention they are receiving at the moment. So I don't see, as long as international community is active on the issue, there would be, let's say, uptick of arms, taking up arms from the side of the Rohingya community. But again, the one thing that I just would like to add is that I said the same thing when I was invited at Bangladesh. There was a Bangladesh foreign minister was there, foreign secretary was there. I was asked the same question. I think the future possibility or future solution of Rohingya lies not only in 100% repatriation. We have to look at three things. One is local integration. Of course, Bangladesh government doesn't like this option, but definitely there is no way I can guarantee 100% that not all of them, 100% of them is going to go back to Myanmar. No, not at all. So there needs to be some kind of local integration program. And also on top of that, there needs to be what we call resettlement under the United Nations plan, so which is part of the UNHCR policy. So there has to be some kind of resettlement, either in the neighboring countries or the Western countries, whatever they are, wherever it is. So some kind of resettlement policy has to be done. And of course, the biggest thing that we would like to see is repatriation. But again, this is going to take time, and it's not going to be easy. But again, what I'm saying is that I'm suggesting is that three solutions have to be explored, and we cannot just rely on only one option, which is 100% repatriation, which I don't believe at all. And then, coming to Uday Banu's question, definitely the CMEC and developments in Indo-Pacific is going to have impact in Myanmar, definitely, because Myanmar, as you know, when it comes to its economy, when it comes to its security, when it comes to its political processes, it largely rely on the help and the support or the advice of foreign governments. See, especially when it comes to economy, definitely it relies on neighboring countries, especially China. And of course, the West has been declining because of different regions. Of course, India is in the recent time, India is also making a lot of greater presence in the country. Therefore, definitely whatever the CMEC, the development with regard to CMEC in Indo-Pacific, definitely it's going to have impact or implications on Myanmar's domestic economy and politics as well. And finally, I would like to the role of civil society. Since 1988, let's say, there has been the role of civil society in Myanmar. But again, what happens is that those civil society, the presence of civil society have not been very vibrant enough to make any significant change at the national level. But of course, after the 2008, I don't know exactly what is it, 2008 that the cyclone Nargis was there?
2009.
Yeah, 2009. Definitely after 2009 cyclone Nargis, there was a huge, let's say, upsurge of civil society in the country in different forms. But again, those were not primarily intended or for political change or political development. But definitely, one thing that we see lacking in Myanmar is the presence of a strong and a vibrant civil society. There are many civil society groups in the country, definitely, from ethnic groups and of course from the majority Burma group as well. But what happens is that they are not very organized in the sense that they are not very vibrant enough to make any significance at the national level. For example, they are either pro-military or pro-NLD. So we need to see autonomous, independent and vibrant civil society in order to make a real change for the welfare and for the benefit of the country, not for a party or not for some leadership. Yeah, I think I will just end by saying that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for answering all the questions very clearly. Rahul, last words on any of the questions? Not necessarily all, because we've already overshot. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. I think I'll continue with what Nehginpao had said. A locally grown Arakan radical movement or terrorist movement is not a possibility. Let us not fall in the trap of this narrative that has been built. And I think Khin Zaw Win can verify this point. Those people are the Rohingya Muslims are not in a position to become radicals and fight Tatmadaw. That's out of question. Only an external support can do that. And that external support is a possibility if, and God forbid, NLD or Aung San Suu Kyi do not follow ICJ procedures or they do not participate in the proceedings. That is going to infuriate the international, at least the Muslim community across the world. So participating in the process is, I think, the way out. And that also, in a way, explains why NLD will not be in a position to revive the constitution, because they have to be dependent on USDP and also Tatmadaw. So Aung San Suu Kyi is not going to be the president, I don't know for how many more years. These two partners, these two pillars have to rely on each other, and that is perhaps the way out. I don't see civil society coming out in this question and this situation and evolving naturally. That evolution of a strong civil society posing a counter or a challenge has to be an abrupt and really an eruption, a revolutionary process. And that again will take a lot of time. Because institutions are not strong, whatever you've got in Myanmar as at the moment is the way out. If there is a willingness to change things, I think these players can only change. If there is not, I'm very sorry to say that things won't change. And I was just curious in answering in that question. The Buddhist clergy, I think for them, this is the best moment. As democracy strengthens in Myanmar from, let's say, 5 years, 10 years from now, things are going to get difficult for them because ethnic minorities will gain strength. Civil society will also grow, and that will not lead the Buddhist clergy, if you can call it a homogeneous community, which is radical right-wing, power nationalist. Then I don't think for them golden days are ahead. They are already at it. This is their peak time.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just one point. Cyclone Nargis was in April, May 2008, not 2009.
2008. Oh, get correct. Thank you. So I would, I think we've far short our time. We've probably exceeded by nearly half an hour. I would like to thank all of you for your really actually stimulating and insightful presentations. I think a lot of insider insights that we've had this afternoon. I'm so glad that ICWA has taken this initiative. This is perhaps one of the first major discussions on the Myanmar elections. Rahul, to answer your question, I think there are other think tanks also planning to do more of the same, perhaps after the elections. And I think one of the two sort of very points that I would just like to flag before I close. One is that we never really got an answer on a future leadership out of this discussion. And I just wonder if that is a sign of poverty or it's a sign of stasis and a lack of movement. But I think this is something worth thinking of. And I think towards the end, we also touched on this whole competition about China, the Indo-Pacific, and where this is likely to go. And again,
sorry, can I have 2 minutes?
Yes, please.
Answer Uday Bandu Singh's question. Just 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Uday Bandu Singh's question. Okay. Yeah. Now, the thing is that CMEC. China is pushing for it. Myanmar government is reacting in a minimalist position. Yes. There are 20 projects, but they haven't done much yet. You know, if the army, if the military and the NLD can really get their act together, we might have a common approach. Now, regarding the Indo-Pacific, I can tell you for certain that the National Defense College is studying the Indo-Pacific a lot. Now, the real guru for them, the National Defense College, is a professor, a dean, he's Burmese, in Japan, International University of Japan. He's ex-military, but he's a dean there. He is regularly conducting classes for the defense academies, defense colleges, and they are devoting a lot of time to the Indo-Pacific. So we'll see some action in time. So
very interesting. Very interesting. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Samatha. Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan, for giving us this opportunity to speak. And I would also like to thank all the participants, the very informed participants that we had, for their questions as well as their attentive listening. So thank you again. Dr. Samatha, would you just like to close the proceedings after this? Thank you from my side as well.
On behalf of ICWA, I thank the moderator and all the panelists for taking out time to join this webinar. I also thank all the participants for joining us today. I take this opportunity to thank DG ICWA, Dr. TCA Raghavan, for his guidance, DDG ICWA Somen Bakshi, and JS ICWA Mrs. Nutan Kapoor Mahavar, and Director Research Dr. Nivedita Ray, and my colleagues and the technical team for the support extended to make this webinar possible. Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.